All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with bite.
Criticize your average woman's hairstyle, and you make an enemy for life. Criticize her character, and you make yourself public enemy number 1. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Runaround is a short story by Isaac Asimov about two men, Powell and Donovan, stationed on Mercury with their robot Speedy. The plot revolves around the accidental creation of a mystery, the solution to which is needed to prevent the astronauts' deaths. Donovan had sent Speedy out on the surface to collect a substance vital to their survival. He hadn't come back, and they've discovered that he is running in circles around the target site, maintaining a set distance from it. They gear up and go out after him, only to find him acting so strangely that they cannot even approach him. Other clues indicate that he had detected volcanic action at the site with results that could damage or even destroy him. Once they figure that out, Powell reminds Donovan that because Speedy is, quote, extremely specialized and as expensive as a battleship, his programming is unusual. Normally, he'd have been programmed with the 3 laws of robotics in order of importance. These are: 1. A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. In Speedy's programming, the last two are equal. He is as averse to taking damage as he is to disobeying an order. Donovan's order wasn't stated as a life or death imperative, just a go-to-location get-substance mission. As a result, Speedy is stuck in a loop between don't disobey and don't take damage, leading him to maintain a distance from the threat and a pattern of movement at which his relation to the two imperatives is equal. Feminists have something in common with Speedy. They're not robots, but they're still kind of programmed, and their rules create a conflict that seems to prevent them from discussing human rights issues without a similar reaction. Consider the identitarians' loyalty to the cult. Women are wonderful, right? And feminism is about equality, of course. These rules are unquestionable, and nearly every interdisciplinary studies student has them drilled into his or her head. Criticize anything about the movement, and you're sure to see someone pop up in your conversation just to alert you to the dictionary definition of feminism. They cannot deal with any argument that doesn't defer to it. There are several different ways to articulate it, but Oxford Online has simplified it to the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of the equality of the sexes, and that does seem to encompass the gist of the other definitions. But if equality is what the movement really wants, the idea of equal consideration for men and boys wouldn't throw them into a paradox that short-circuits the entire conversation. We've talked before about the negative-sum game in which that consideration is seen to eliminate compassion for adversity that society otherwise cares about when only women's experiences are considered. That phenomenon gets even more knee-jerk when accountability comes into question, with equal expectations of women being seen as wrongly exempting men, leading to much wailing and gnashing of teeth. Negative-sum loud. We see this every day on social media, in their responses to complaints about anti-male discriminatory law and policy, or research that ignores men's experiences and then gets used to justify government initiatives that benefit women at men's expense. For example, try mentioning the circumstances faced by male victims of female sexual violence. The combined ideas of equal consideration for men and expectation of equal accountability from women do not compute with feminists. Result? Keeping them on topic is nearly impossible. Some try to redirect back to female victims. Some try to pacify the debater by claiming to agree on the subject of gay rape, showing only that their compassion for male victims is limited by the sex of their perpetrators. Many deny, castigate, deflect, and block. Often the discussion gets trapped in a blame-throwing loop. This is because it creates a paradox among aspects of feminist ideological and social programming, beginning with the female oppression narrative under patriarchy theory, which does two things to their concept of identity. First, they think largely in terms of demographic rather than individual, so that their response to information about any woman ends up being not about her, but to the group women, which for feminist women includes themselves, and for feminist men includes milady, or every woman he knows. This manifests in the aforementioned debate as a supposition. You say women can be perpetrators? You're calling women perpetrators. How dare you talk about me, or milady, that way? Don't believe me? Try discussing the impact of custody interference and alienation of fathers on their children. See how much shining armor comes out of the woods as both sexes rush to defend the sainted single mother against the scourge of dastardly deadbeat dads. Second, it leads to damaging group identities. Patriarchy theory makes the female identity victim. It makes the male identity either perpetrator-oppressor or victim of other men's masculinity, but not quite so victimized as a woman who requires protection from other men. We'll call this the embattled hero identity for short. The one good man, as Alison has described, is one category of embattled hero. Another is the effeminate guy who can't be himself because you're too rugged. I might have to write about that guy sometime soon, because I keep running into him on Twitter, along with the recovered toxic masculinity addict, feminism's version of the redeemed sinner in savior-based religions. No deviation from this identity script is allowed. Feminism ties women's value as human beings to their victim identity, and men's value to their service or benefit to female victims. Known victim becomes synonymous with good person in the female identity, while victim in denial is a bad person. Obviously, perpetrator-oppressor would be men's bad person identity, and embattled hero would be the good. This programs into the feminist mind an aversion to recognizing that women can act as abusers or even make bad choices, as the listener's good person identity would be challenged. Throw in recognition that female abusers can victimize men, and the perceived challenge becomes an all-out assault. Feminists, therefore, are set up to see men's rights advocacy as an attack on women regardless, but they also don't want to consider themselves prejudiced against men. It's pretty normal to want to be seen as a good, compassionate person. This is an aspect of the mental health of any social being. It's part of one's self-image, viewing oneself as deserving to be loved and appreciated, a condition which relies on exhibiting socially approved characteristics, and being a net benefit to one's community and one's society. Without it, what's left? Rejection? Condemnation? Exclusion? Social exile? So what's a victim identitarian to do? Ideologically, they must object to inequality whenever they consider a condition or circumstance to benefit men to the detriment of women. But they cannot abide the same when the conditions or circumstances in question benefit women to the detriment of men. Even acknowledging such a phenomenon would come into conflict with their female victim, male oppressor identity, but those factors are becoming more and more apparent in everyday political discourse. They also cannot recognize that any of men's advantages might have been achieved by facing, enduring, and overcoming adversity through hard work, dedication, personal development, and self-sacrifice, and that such is the pathway to achieve those particular advantages. That's why the wage gap myth just will not die. The perpetrator-oppressor identity requires that men's advantages must be ill-gotten, thereby creating a debt to women. This is also why the definition refers to rights, but not responsibility. She who cannot be accountable cannot be responsible, especially not when it's hard, uncomfortable, unpleasant, dangerous, or expensive. The movement can only support a standard that will improve women's outcome without imposing any obligation or consequence on them, even if that means deflecting those to men. Yet they cannot admit that their narratives promote inequality. They cannot acknowledge that their characterization of men is derogatory, cruel, and hateful. They cannot even consider the idea that women's advocacy might be remotely responsible for any disadvantages faced by either sex, and they certainly can't take responsibility for reform, because that would require admitting that reform is needed. Like Speedy, the conflicted robot, they have to maintain a distance and pattern of movement at which their relation to these contradictory factors is equal. That is feminism's brand of equality, not a partnership between men and women, but a complicated dance between irresponsibility and authority, hatred and social acceptability, prejudice and the appearance of being a human rights activist. And they've been stuck in that loop for over 200 years. Women are oppressed.
Based on what evidence?
Women face hardship.
Men also face hardship.
Women's hardship is harder.
What's the difference?
Women are oppressed.
Based on what evidence?
Women face hardship.
Men also face hardship.
Women's hardship is harder.
What's the difference?
Women are oppressed.
Based on what evidence?
Women face hardship.
Men also face hardship.
Women's hardship is harder.
What's the difference?
Women are oppressed.
Based on what evidence?
Women face hardship.
Men also face hardship.
Women's hardship is harder.
What's the difference?
Women are oppressed.
Based on what evidence?
Women face hardship.
Men also face hardship.
Women's hardship is harder.
What's the difference?
Women are oppressed.
Based on what evidence?
Women face hardship.
Men also face hardship.
Women's hardship is harder. What's the difference? Women are oppressed.
Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 90, Mistakes, the victim identity of identitarian conflict loop, I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with She Who Must Be Obeyed, Karen Strawn, and Nonsense Annihilator, Lauren B., to short-circuit a few NPCs. But first, as usual, we've got a couple of other things to go over. If you haven't already, you need to head on over to badgerfeed.com and register to receive notifications if you want to know what the Badgers have going on every day. And if you want to support our work despite the latest adpocalypse, feedthebadger.com is the most stable way to help. Remember, information is power, and we have it. Go to Badgerfeed for information, and feed the Badger to help us share that information. And, speaking of sharing information, don't forget to smash that like button and share us on every social media site you use. Grab some popcorn, throw open the gates of reason, and unleash your friendly neighborhood badgers on Normie Society. There's lots to talk about. We can start with how hard it is to talk about female accountability in a society that considers women everyone's responsibility but their own.
Well, I just wanted to say we also have another guest in the studio tonight. It's called Hypnotoad. Made an appearance at the end of the intro, which I think is actually kind of cool because I really love it. All hail the Hypnotoad. It is really, really difficult to get anybody to, like Terry Brennan tweeted, was it today or yesterday? I wonder why the prisons are filled with men. And a link to a Guardian article about a group of 6 young women, aged 16 to 20, who attacked another woman, physically attacked her in the UK, and I guess she ended up with some kind of brain injury, subdural hematoma or something. Hit her head so hard that she went into a coma and she died a week or 2 later. And the alleged ringleader of this attack, the one who actually was, let's go get this girl, and then did the majority of the beating, right? She's being referred to I guess it's a form of probation, right? That's all she's getting is you have to behave for the next year or whatever, the next 12 months. And if you break the law again, then you'll go to prison for the remainder of that 12 months, right? So it's like, and then they, I see it all the time. Well, prisons are full of men because men are more violent. Well, if you're twice as likely to be convicted of a violent crime if you're a man under all of the same circumstances, and then you're sentenced to more time and you're less likely to get out early be released early, and all of these things, then how do we know that the prison population actually reflects the behavior of men and women, right? The prison ratios between men and women. How do we know that, right? And I would love for somebody in the United States to actually go and sort of reverse engineer all of these discounts. Somebody in the UK did and found that in the UK, I believe it's 85 to 90% of people in prison are men. And but he went and he essentially crunched the numbers through reverse engineering and found that if men were treated exactly the way women are treated in the criminal justice system, 5 out of 6 men in UK prisons would not be there, which would not make it a 50-50 split, but it would be something more like 65-35, right? Or 70-30, not something that's like, 95% men and 5% women. I think it's 93-7 or something like that in the UK. So it would not appear to be such a huge disparity in the level of criminality between men and women that you would assume from the populations of men and women in prison in the UK. So I mean, like I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, and this was before Madam Justice Hale and a feminist task force released a report and essentially ordered judges and magistrates to consider that what did they call it? A misguided notion of equality has led to some very unequal treatment of women and girls, and therefore you need to actually consider that when sentencing women and girls and sentence them more leniently. So we had this sort of socially derived informal bias in the court system already, but then in 2011, not only was that bias affirmed, it was actually mandated by the court system, and so it's now entrenched policy to treat women more leniently than men, and maybe even to treat women more leniently than they already were being treated, right? And you can even see this too, when if you go watch, it's on the official British government website. Philip Davies arguing with I think it was the Backbench Business Committee or some other subcommittee, right? Arguing with them about the gender justice gap, which is one of his areas of absolute expertise, and he's been so good on it, so good at pushing that into the public dialogue, right? But he's trying to tell these women on this, I guess, Equalities Commission that women are treated more leniently, and they're saying women are treated, they just repeat it over and over again. Women are treated equally. Women are treated equally in our justice system. And then he says, well, not according to feminists, because feminists say that it's a travesty and it's an injustice that women are more likely, when they're brought up on charges, to get fines than men are. And he says, but you know why that is? Because when a woman gets a fine, a man gets prison time. Right? That's why women get more fines than men. No, they don't fine men, they just put them in prison. Right? They fine women, and feminists are complaining, and the Equalities Commission is complaining that women get more fines than men, and that's unfair treatment.
It's ridiculous
against women. It's so bizarre. Like I literally this one thread that on Twitter that I joined in on, where I don't know any of the people in the thread, but somebody made a tweet or posted a link or something like that and said, I wonder what women would have to say about this. And I essentially just said, every time I hear a feminist open her mouth, I feel like I'm living in upside down land. And I made a lot of sort of new Twitter friends that way. So
yeah.
Yeah.
What I think is really disgusting is when these women who are criminals or being convicted of something, whatever, if they happen to be a mother, they can use the kid, a single mother, they can use the kid as an excuse to avoid jail time because there's no one there to care for the kid.
Yeah, and it works the
it's
other way with
disgusting.
men. Judge will
Yeah.
actually be more harsh on a father because of the example he presents to the child.
Mhm.
So the question becomes, do judges not think mothers can be examples to their children?
Right.
No,
Well,
women have.
they're perfectly happy with the examples that they're setting so far. They're just perfectly happy to let them go on being criminals and, avoiding jail time. That's a good example of a parent, right? But not if you're a man. That's you. There's no way that you can be a good parent and also have done this horrible thing. I don't know. I throw my hands up in frustration.
Well, and what's really frustrating to me is you get in discussions with people. Like I discuss a lot of this stuff with people on social media. I used to discuss it a little bit on Facebook, but I really don't use Facebook much anymore. I discussed it a lot on Reddit. Karen has too. And then, of course, I do a lot of knockdown, drag-out fighting about it on Twitter. And, like, I've gotten to the point where there's some things I just don't have any patience for anymore. Because there are certain arguments that are just flat-out disingenuous. And I've started to recognize there is a certain flavor of response you get from people who are readers of We Hunted the Mammoth, formerly Man Boobs. Or people who basically take a victim identity mentality plus how can we twist this against men plus how can we twist this against our MRAs, and that's the filter through which all of their arguments goes. But one of the things that I've noticed is that short circuit I talked about, that happens every time you talk about any kind of equal treatment that would rely on equal accountability. So you bring up the wage gap myth, or somebody asserts the wage gap myth and you discredit it based on the differences in work habits. You get arguments back that instead of acknowledging, hey, employers benefit from people who show up to work, do their jobs, don't have tasks that they're above doing, and actually exhibit a good performance on the job, who are reliable, who are willing to work overtime, who are willing to work hours that maybe aren't the most popular to work, like weekends or second shift or third shift. And so they might pay more for those things. Nobody can recognize that. Nobody can accept that if they're trying to argue that women are victims of it. So then they have to turn around and say, well, that's because work is geared around men. And they'll claim
it's
that
not
it's
women
designed
friendly
for
enough.
men. Right? It's not designed for men. It's designed for employers. And women are not as good at men as fitting into that design.
Well, I think women are as good as men at fitting into it. They just don't. They just don't choose to. I mean, like, one of the things that when I was interviewing for the last job that I had, right? And my manager, the manager was female. And she, asked me if I had any kids, and I said 3. And she kind of pulls a little bit of a face. And I said, and they're my first priority, right? They're absolutely my number one priority. And because they're my number one priority, and I'm the only thing keeping a roof over their head and their bellies full, that means my work is really my number one priority, right? Like actually showing up to the job, doing the work, not getting fired, right? All of that stuff. That's really my number one priority in terms of this, because that's the only thing that keeps my kids from living in a cardboard box. And then she just hired me that afternoon. So, I mean, but you really have to, I think there is, and I think that there was a work ethic on the part of a lot of women. You know, you had working class women, their lives were not easy. 100 years ago, 70 years ago, my grandmother's life wasn't easy. My grandmother worked outside the home and in the home, right? And her husband worked his butt off. So like they rarely rested when they were raising a young family. My grandfather paved roads in the summer. That's a sun up to sundown job. And in Edmonton, Alberta, at this latitude, sun up to sundown is 5 a.m. until 10 p.m. Right? And you worked all day doing that because you had to make hay while the sun was shining, right? And then with in the winters, he carried mail on foot to farms. Right, that couldn't have been fun. Those dirt roads weren't plowed. He was walking from farm to farm, delivering frickin' mail. So I mean, you're looking at a situation where, and my grandmother, she ran a general store and a post office, and she raised 3 kids, and she cooked pot roast for lunch for when the kids came home from school, and she did all of the bookkeeping for the store and the post office and all of that stuff. I mean, she was a dynamo. Like, they both had an incredible work ethic. They both worked really, really, really hard. And I don't think either of them ever resented the other for sitting down once in a while. But it's like now our lives are so easy to compare to that, right? I mean, like, she was raising a family of 3 while running 2 businesses, right? While doing all of the cooking from scratch in a kitchen where she was lucky enough to have cold water, a cold water hand pump inside her house, inside her kitchen.
My dad used to talk about my great grandmother's method for doing laundry on the farm. She had a big wash tub that she would fill with water from the well, which she would haul it out to the well. She would get the water, she would haul it back in. When they got a kitchen hand pump, that was a luxury. But yeah, she would fill that up with water, and then she had a thing that she had to drop into it that you plugged it in, and then you didn't touch the water. You had to unplug the device. You didn't touch the tub. You didn't touch anything, or you would get electrocuted. Not just shocked, but electrocuted.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And so the kids weren't allowed anywhere near it, like, at all. But that was how she did her laundry, how she heated her water for her laundry. And then it didn't really have the agitation feature, you know. It wasn't like a regular washing machine.
No, it was a wash tub. You had to agitate it yourself. You had to, yeah.
And then you
had to use a washboard, yeah.
She had a wringer that she had to roll each piece of laundry through individually, and then she had to take it and hang it all up. And
yeah,
that was
no,
laundry
like
day.
A washboard is actually called a washboard for a reason, and it's not because, like, Cajun musicians, play it, with a drumstick on a washboard. No, it's because that's what women used to wash laundry on, right? And so it's like you look at how easy our lives are right now, at least in terms of those of us who are able to have nice things, right? So I would say anybody, including the working poor today, have things better than my grandmother did in terms of just being able to delegate work to machinery, delegate work to outsource it to other people.
Yeah,
I
honestly,
mean, we outsourced bringing water into the kitchen. We just turn a tap. We don't even have to pump the hand lever, right, that my grandmother had, and we've outsourced that to the city of Edmonton. And the water's just delivered to us,
and it's clean
through the tap. Yeah, and it's clean.
Like,
So, I mean, like,
in today's,
we don't
when
need to boil it before
Yeah.
cooking with it.
when we got hit by the tornado, we had a short time of the inconvenience of having to boil water before using it for food or bathing and stuff like that, because they weren't sure. They didn't have like, oh, this is definitely they just weren't sure. They just hadn't had a chance to go over all of the pipeline to make sure that it wasn't contaminated. And so they gave us this boil advisory for, I think it was like a week in my area. And everybody was just, oh, this is so horrible, I gotta boil all my water. Like, there are people that always had to do that. They had a well, but they couldn't trust that the water was clean. And so I mean,
and they
I
also
don't
had
think,
an outhouse, and sometimes the outhouse wasn't that far
from the well. But I don't think in the time period, because I've had 3 jobs at once before, multiple times in my life. I don't think there was ever a time when I did as much work between even all 3 jobs as my great-grandmother did on the farm every day. And so accountability differs by generation. I would say the same thing. I think my great-grandfather's life and the tasks that he had to do were far harder than the tasks that, say, my dad had to do in his jobs. Partly because there were dramatically different jobs. My husband actually, he probably, his job is more manual labor intensive than my dad's work was. But that's because my dad is a school teacher, a retired school teacher. Now, he did other things, and then when he was in college, he did a very labor-intensive job. He worked on the county highway. He shoveled hot mix onto the road and flattened it out. And he had a boss that didn't like him. There was something like his family had conflict with the boss's family or something along those lines. So he came into a situation that didn't really have anything to do with him personally, but his boss didn't want him working there, and he couldn't just not have him, so he tried to get rid of him. Oh, I remember what it was. One of the other guys had actually lied about him. He had told me this story before, and it's been a long time. But one of the other guys had blamed a bunch of stuff on him. It wasn't a family thing. It was he was believed to have been the cause of somebody else's failure. So the boss was trying to get rid of him, and he gave him an impossible task. And my dad knew immediately what was going on. So he decided he was going to do the impossible task, and he did it. It was basically shoveling all the hot mix onto an intersection. And have you ever seen those trucks that have the big wheel in the front that they use to flatten that out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, they have
steamroller.
Yeah, they have hand versions of those.
Yeah.
And that was what his job was that day, was to put that there and flatten it all out so they could put the markings on and everything. And he was a strong young college student. He about killed himself doing it, but he did it. Well, years later, at our county fair, my dad was on the fair board, so I was there every day. And I ran into this guy who he recognized my face, and immediately, you're your dad's daughter, aren't you? And yeah, how did you know that? Same face. So he's like, yeah, I used to be his boss when he was on the county highway. And he literally said to me, if I gave your dad a toothbrush and told him to clean this whole area, and he points to this great big area of pavement, he'd get it done. I don't know how, but he'd get it done. He was the best worker I ever had. So like years and years later, this happened before I was born. And I was in high school when this guy told me this. He still remembered how hard Dad worked to get that done. And it's like that kind of thing. I see that with the men in my life all the time. And I tried to live up to it myself simply because, I obviously, if anybody can't tell, I have a lot of admiration for my dad. You're not very observant. But I have had jobs where there's been a misunderstanding and I've been given a task that I haven't been trained on, or I wasn't given the materials to do the task or things like that, and I've gotten them done because that's what you do. But I've worked with a lot of women who all they have to have is one thing that isn't right. I have all the materials, but they're not in the right places, so I can't find one of them. Did you look? Well, I looked where they're supposed to be, and that's it. The job doesn't get done. And that's one of the things that I have. And of course, it's victim blaming. Why didn't you look anywhere else?
Yeah. I have a real problem with people that come to and ask me questions that they can answer themselves, because that is the biggest time thief of my day. But, when you look at like millennials and the zennials and all the younger generations, and you look at how they act, how they behave, they're not getting married. They're not creating families or having kids. There's no wonder that the work ethic is also taking a hit. I can't find young people willing to work. I mean, I had a guy, he was 24, okay? And for most of the day, you're sitting there on your phone, and that's fine. It's like nobody cares. The job is not that labor intensive that, you should feel burdened by coming to work every day because there's so much downtime. This kid had it easy. He had it easy, but he didn't like people asking him to do things. He didn't like having the responsibilities. So what did he do? He found another job and he left. Well, not even a week later, and even to this day, this kid is still texting me, asking me if he can come back to work. I guess it didn't work out over there, but it was a lesson that this kid had to learn because you had this great opportunity and you just didn't feel like being told anything. So you lose it. You left, you made your decision to leave, and now you want it back. And I'm sorry, but it's gone. That's a hard lesson that you're going to have to learn. But even aside from that, just trying to find people, skilled workers, we will train people, we will train you, and we cannot find people who come into work on time, ready to work, willing to work, and actually want to work. It's like the saying that my mentor from almost more than 20 years ago told me, everybody wants a job, but nobody wants to work. And it's even more true now.
Oh, yeah. And I think, when I look at it, one of the things that I think, and my daughter, Rachel, she saw this with my son because I got my son his first job, right? He was cold applying to a bunch of places. He wasn't getting any callbacks because he's just some high school graduate with nothing to recommend him, right? And so I was just like, the dishwasher where I worked was, she was moving on to bigger and better things. She was from Colombia and she'd moved here on a work visa with her daughter, and she was a lab technician or something like that, trained in Colombia, but she needed to learn English. And so you'd go into the dish pit and you would see her talking to herself all the time. And I always thought she was like talking on the phone or something through a Bluetooth earpiece or something like that. But no, she was actually taking English through, an app, right? Learning English through an app. And so the day came when she came in and she had her hair styled all nicely and freshly cut. She was wearing makeup and all of that. And she was coming to essentially, on her day off to tell the boss, give her notice and say, I got a job in a lab. This is great. And everybody was like, way to go. That's so awesome. So we were out a dishwasher. And I just went up to my boss and I said, hire my son. And she was a little bit dubious. And she said, it's not going to get weird, is it? And I said, no. And she says, he's not going to object or get upset when I insult you or razz you or pick on you. Because she picked on everybody, but in a fun way. And I'm like, no. He'd probably hold my arms behind my back and let you have free shots, right? So she's like, what if I have to fire him? Is that going to make things weird? And I'm like, no, that'll be a lesson that he needs to learn. If he can't measure up to a freaking dishwashing job at age 19 or 18 rather, then, you know, he's going to have to deal with that, right? And he managed to, like, the first 3 days, oh, he sucked so bad because it's a lot. Like, I don't know if any of you have been a dishwasher in a commercial kitchen, but it's a lot of heavy lifting, and it's a lot of reaching, and it's a lot of stretching and bending and all of that. And if you're not used to putting in between 6 and 8 hours of just lifting shit and carrying shit and lugging shit and hauling shit, and, you know, if you're in any way soft, well, you know, the job is almost going to kill you in the first couple of days. And the assistant manager, Mike, who is one of my favorite managers, came up to me about a week in and said, I almost had to fire him, you know. And I'm like, oh, I know, because he sucked. He sucked those first few days. But then he built up the muscle and got the hang of it and found a rhythm and, you know, a system. But it's like, I essentially told him, right? Like, you know, they're hiring you as a favor to me. This is the last favor that you get from me regarding this job. I'm not going to beg for you. I'm not going to plead for you. If you screw up, that's on you, and you're done, and you go, right? And I'm hearing from certain people that there are parents who go to job interviews with their adult children now, right? And that when their kids don't get the job, their parents phone and demand, you know, why didn't you hire my son or my daughter? And I'm like,
hell, my first answer would be because you showed up at the interview.
Yeah, no, it's like, I asked them to do me a favor. He sat down for an actual interview with the assistant manager, answered a bunch of questions. They hired him for that night. They essentially, they were just like, the guy who was scheduled to start today phoned us and said, too bad. At least he phoned us and didn't just not show up. So you can start tonight. We'll give you a shot. And, you know, like, but it's like, after this, son, this is all on you. Right. And you have to do a good job. You have to make yourself a valuable employee. You have to get along with everybody as well. That's part of it. So you can't just be, you know, off in your own little corner, not talking to people. You have to learn how to be sociable. Otherwise, everybody's going to be creeped out and weirded out around you. So, I mean, like, because he was always a bit of a loner, right? You know, a little bit of not a social outcast, because he had plenty of people who wanted to be his friend. He just had no time for friends. But anyway, like, it's just like, you look at how I approach that and how a lot of parents these days of children that age approach that, right? And I think it really is a class thing too, because I don't think a working class mother, right, someone who spent 20 years waiting tables, right, would phone a potential employer of her child and reach out for not hiring them and demand to know why, right? I don't think a working class mother would do that.
No, that's too entitled.
That's like that's a helicopter, middle class helicopter parent, right there.
Oh god, and
helicopter
helicopter parents are destroying the next generation. Like, we had a set of those that just drove me nuts when my son was in elementary school, and they would mess up the simplest things. Okay, so my son's elementary school career was basically like, we moved in the middle of it. He started out at one school, then went a few years to a different school, and then we moved again, and I think he finished at the first school before going on to middle school. So we went back and forth and saw two different schools and two different ways of doing things. Well, the first school he was at was in a neighborhood where it was on the corner of a block that didn't have, like, the other direction was fields and woods and stuff, and the corner was a main street in the city and a side street. And the main street is 35-mile-an-hour traffic up to the school zone, and then it's 20, and then it goes back up to 35, and it's 35, I think, almost all the way through the Dayton metro area. Like, there's all these streets that are like 35 to 45 miles an hour all the way through the Dayton metro area. And we had this problem of parents would crowd in front of the door, and the kids couldn't come out, and nobody could get their kids, and there'd be this traffic jam, and traffic would back up on this main street, and the cops were having to be there all the time because of accidents, because people were getting rear-ended or pulling out into traffic, passing people on the wrong side of the road where there's you're in the city, it's a double yellow line. And it was largely a problem of me first among the parents. So... And then you had the walkers and the riders all coming out of the same place, and the buses couldn't get the kids. It was a mess. And the new principal at that school created a system. And so if you were walking your child, you had a different door to go to than if you were driving your child. And if the children were getting on the bus, there was an area the bus would pull up to. And walkers didn't come out of there, and you did not pick your child up in that area. You picked your child up where the car riders were getting picked up, and you had a line to wait in if your kid was a car rider, and you were to stay in that line, and there were a set of adults and older students who were to guide the students to their right car, make sure that they matched the student with the correct parent and got confirmation, and then the parent and the student would take off. And the parents, the helicopter parents, couldn't handle that. So they wouldn't get in line. They would park somewhere. A lot of them across the street from the school. And then they would walk across the street. Yeah. They'd walk across it. There's not where
there's
they
not
were
a crosswalk
walking.
there.
Yeah, there's a crosswalk, but there's not a light where they were walking.
Yeah.
So they're crossing the middle of the street. And there's a split. Basically, if you're coming from one direction, you could turn right, but not turn left into the school. You had to go around the corner and turn into the school. You couldn't turn into the school from the main drag. So they're basically parking down this side street that's across the street from the school, walking across the street, walking up to the door, which really destroyed the security of the situation, and demanding their children. And in order to deal with the helicopter parents, the school actually had to keep the children inside the school and not let them out except one at a time to go to the next car. Whose parent is here? Billy. Okay, Billy, come out. You get in your mom's car and you guys go. Whose parent is here? Chrissy. Oh, Chrissy, come out. And that was the way they dealt with it until the helicopter parents settled down. There was one parent who was allowed to stand at the door. And that one parent that was allowed to stand at the door, he was allowed to stand there because there was a kidnapping risk from his ex-wife. That would be Roger from the 7 Years in Hell story.
Oh, yeah. Well, there you go.
And that was, when my son was older. He was allowed, and he would be up there waiting. And when he got there, they would find his daughter, and they would bring her out, and he would take his daughter and go. And that was that. And there would be... all these parents that would, well, if he can stand up there, I should be able to stand up there. Well, is your ex threatening to kidnap your child? Right. If not, get in your car. And this is what we had to deal with. And there's a lot of kids that are raised in this environment where the school gives them a project. This is how the Mohawk lived. This is the type of house they had. Here's the materials. Build one. And the kid brings in a perfect one because mom or dad built it. You know,
Oh,
my,
yeah.
my kid brings in one that he built with mom or dad standing there, and saying, okay, this instruction means this material and this material. You know, if he didn't already figure it out himself, which he did most of the time, because that elementary school stuff is usually pretty, it's made for the elementary school kids to understand, you know. So it was basically just, you know, hey, don't eat the glue, which, you know, some kids might do, or don't panic just because you spilled that. We can go get more, you know, and stuff like that. And the difference that you get when you do your child's project versus when your child does your child's project is in your child's ability to handle performing a task from beginning to end, no matter how big it looks, by dividing it into steps, and dealing with each step as it goes along, and any issue that comes up, you know, figuring out how to deal with those issues, and knowing who to go to for help with those issues and everything. So if you're doing your child's project, they don't learn any of those lessons. And a lot of times those projects, like, I don't think we're ever going to need to actually know how to build a longhouse in real life. It just doesn't strike me that we're ever going to do that. But from that project, you know, he learns there are several steps to this process. Let's read all the steps, know what we're looking at in the long run, and then do each step with the fact that the next step is coming in mind. And here's how to use the materials, and here's what to do if something breaks, and so on. And a lot of times I think we get parents that allow their children to, I'm bored, I don't want to do this is too hard, I'm going to go watch TV, I'm going to go play video games. Or you get parents that, if it's not going to be perfect, they don't want to send their child to school with it. And then they never learn how to deal with failure.
Yeah, and you also have the parents that just refuse to let their child fail in school. So, you know, there's no way that you're going to get a failing grade. So if I have to do the work for you, then I'll step in and do it for you. But it's a crutch, you know, and you are failing your child if you do that to them in so many ways. But, you know, how do you stop that from happening? You can't. Like, there's no way to prevent that. At least not that I can see. You know, parental intervention in your child's education, for an overly attached and you know, just obsessive parent, you are a victim of your parent. If the child is a victim of their parent. So, you know, the discipline is gone. People do not they do not grow up with disciplinarians in the household, because we know most people grow up with single mothers. And, you know, I know single mothers can be authoritarian, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the child views them as a valid source of discipline, you know? So it's just...
Well, I mean, to that issue, fathers tend to, and these are just patterns, you know, sort of like 85% versus 15%, you know, so 15% of men will have the opposite parenting style to the typical, and same with women, right?
Mm-hmm.
Women set lots of boundaries. They make lots of rules, but they're really soft and sloppy in terms of enforcing them. Men set fewer boundaries, and they actually will push children away, right? In terms of push children over boundaries, you know, over the kids' own internal set boundaries, right? Like, I don't want to learn how to ride a bike. I fell off the bike the last time I tried, right? Things like that. And men will actually push those boundaries, but when they actually set a boundary that you go this far, no further, right, they are much more likely to actually rigorously enforce those boundaries than mothers are. And so, I mean,
they really matter.
Yeah, they do. I mean, it's not just some arbitrary crap. You know, and like, I don't know, I think I had two parents that exercised a more typically male style of parenting, because my mother and father both deplored whining. They both, kind of had the, this is the world's tiniest violin playing just for you, kind of thing when I was being hard done by, that like in the Christmas Story when he's having that fantasy about how, about how one day he's going to go blind, and then his parents will be sorry for having treated him so badly, right? And so I mean, it's like you have this situation where there is this bizarre reversal, right? Because as a kid, I had tons of unstructured time, right? I had chores that I needed to do. I had rules that I needed to follow, but at the same time, my mom would just kind of pack me a sandwich and a canteen of water, like my dad's old World War II canteen, souvenir canteen, that he got off of a German soldier. She would pack that and into a backpack for me and send me off on my bike, and Darren would say, come home when it feels like dinner time, right? And just let me roam around the entire neighborhood at age like 8, 10 years old, right? Like lots of free time to go out and explore the world with my same age peers, without adult supervision. It was absolutely glorious, right? But at the same time, there were certain things that I had to do, often that no kid would really want to do, like, get dinner on, come home from school at age 10, put a chicken in the oven, peel some potatoes, get them ready to, into some water to put on the boil when my parents got home and things like that, right? Peel a bunch of carrots and stuff like that, right? So, I mean, like I had chores that I had to do, and I had all of this free time to be a kid with other kids without adults around, right? And now we've gone completely the other way. The kids don't have chores, right? They're not made to do things that they don't want to do, but every single moment of their lives appears to be structured by their parents. So it's like you're not letting your kids walk to school, you're driving them, because it's not safe to let them walk to and from school, right? Even though it was safe for me to walk to and from school from the age of, from kindergarten. Like first day of kindergarten, my mom walked me, and then I told her to just, don't bother anymore, right? And so, you have these parents who chauffeur their kids to and from school. Immediately after school, there's soccer practice or ballet lessons or gymnastics or some other kind of extracurricular activity that they need to be involved in that's like completely arranged through adults arranging it for them. Or there's play dates that have been arranged by the parents. Can Cole come over to play with Sam today, right? And all of that. And it's like there was never any of that. Just like go knock on your friend's door and see if they can come out and play. There was never any of that, right? You're getting on my nerves, kid. Take off and go see if Darren can come out to play, right? And if Darren's not available, walk a block and find out if Jan's available. If Jan's not available, walk another block and find out if Paul's available to come out to play, right? Because so, I mean, like on the one hand, kids are surrounded by these boundaries, but they're not boundaries in terms of you're not allowed to do this particular thing. They're boundaries in terms of adults are going to supervise and mediate your every interaction with other children and all of your activities outside of school. And that I think is just really not a good thing. It's not a good thing.
No, it's micromanagement. That's the only way that I can it's micromanagement. And that never works well.
See, well, no. I was always like, who wants that kind of fucking work? Like, what, are having kids a second fucking job? Right? I already have a job. Do I need to turn my kids into some kind of fucking career? Right? No. I'll
Oh.
do the raised by wolves style of parenting that I grew up with. When they're home, they have to do certain things. Then they can go outside and play. And as long as I have some idea of where they are and that they're safe, then I'm fine with that. We had a park right across the street for the whole time my kids were young. I could look out one of the windows and see them at any given time to check on them. So, like, I didn't have to go sit. There were parents whose kids almost never went to the park because the parent didn't have time to go sit on the bench for the full hour that the kid was playing at the park that day, wanted to play, so the kid just didn't go. And it's like, your kid's as old as my kids. My kids go unsupervised to the park. You live 3 houses down from me.
Yeah,
right?
We had the same situation in my neighborhood. And what it actually comes down to there is, as a parent, with your kids, that raised by wolves kind of parenting, which it's kind of funny to call it that, because you're still, everything that you do still has a reason, right? One of the reasons is your kid learns on their own better than anything, that every choice they make, there's a set of results to those choices, and some of the results are rewards and some of the results are consequences, and rewards and consequences don't all come from mom and dad. Sometimes they come from the world. Sometimes they come from, hey, don't reach for the telephone line because it's actually a power line and it will shock you, and you're lucky you didn't get electrocuted. Sometimes they come from, don't chase the smart aleck, the neighborhood smart aleck, up to the top of the backstop of the baseball diamond because she can climb down and you can't. Sometimes you find yourself being the consequences for somebody else's bad choices. And then sometimes there are consequences for being that person too. I got in big trouble because the fire department had to rescue him. So Mom was like, why didn't you just come home? Like, well, now he won't pick on me again. Yes, but the fire department had to come get him down. Oh, well, okay. So you learn things, and you learn things by discovery. And discovery learning is probably the most prevalent way that people learn things. It's how you learn to talk. It's how you learn to walk. It's how you learn to basically exist in the world. And it's how you learn to read. Even though you're being instructed, it's how you learn to read. You don't learn, nobody teaches you how to read. You discover how to read. Parents who neglect discovery learning, and I think a lot of times parents have a tendency to neglect their daughter's discovery learning more because they're more protective of their daughters. And they don't trust their daughter's instincts as well as they trust their son's instincts, because there's this perception that girls are weaker and more vulnerable, and that the reward of that is getting out of stuff, supposedly. I don't know whether I'd call it a reward, because a lot of the stuff you get out of teaches you important lessons in life, right? But the consequence of it is you're not as trusted. And what ends up happening as they get older is there ends up being that accountability gap. There ends up being a gap in expectations, right? Women face the soft sexism of low expectations from their mothers, from their aunts, from their teachers, from their older sisters, and from the men in their lives, and the boys in their lives. And they live down to them all too often. And so as a parent, it's you against all of society with respect to your kids, where all of society is going to hold your son responsible or accountable for things that he can't do anything about, that aren't really his fault. Somebody does something to themselves and gets hurt, and he's there. It's not his fault for not protecting them from their own stupidity, right? But at the same time, they're going to put weakness on your daughter, and it's you against the entire rest of the world to balance that out and raise your child at home to understand the results, whether they're consequences or rewards or neutral or whatever, of their choices, their actions, and to help your son learn to defend himself against false responsibility and recognize the difference between that and things he is responsible for, like protecting himself, and anything that he takes responsibility for, because once you take responsibility for something, you're responsible for it, and it's your responsibility to teach your daughter that being a girl doesn't change how responsible she should be for herself or how accountable she is for her choices or her actions. And that's going to be a hard thing. And it's, as every generation goes past, it seems to be getting harder and harder, because we are allowing our children less and less personal autonomy as they grow up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and Stefan Molyneux also said, here I am, right, as a father, trying to impart on my daughter the idea of personal responsibility and being, owning your actions and owning your mistakes, as and being independent and all of this, right? And every time she leaves the house, she's subjected to this Greek chorus telling her how she's a victim of all kinds of things outside of her own locus of control, and how she really shouldn't be held accountable for any of her bad behavior and all of this stuff, right? And he's just like, as a father, it just makes me crazy, because like, part of me is, he essentially said to me, part of me is like, she needs to go out in the world and experience things, right, and learn how to stand on her own 2 feet. But the world, not me, the world is telling her that she doesn't need to do that, and she can just essentially coast on this idea that women are oppressed and therefore shouldn't be expected to live up to the same expectations as boys, and they shouldn't be held as accountable as boys, and they should be given free stuff and all of that, right? And so I think that for parents, it's a real challenge with girls in a way that it just isn't with boys. With boys, I mean, like, when you see Rosie Batty in Australia going into middle schools to essentially have assemblies with the boys there to make them take a pledge to never physically harm a woman, child, and to take responsibility for male violence against women, right? I think that is a grossly unfair imposition of responsibility on young boys. That is, like, I think that's abusive, right? That requirement for them to take responsibility for their complicity in male violence against women, I guess, and their complicity with patriarchy and all of that crap. Right?
You gotta love how they call it complicity when, at the same time, if you talk about how rape laws exclude female perpetration against male victims, the first thing out of most feminist mouths is, well, men wrote the rape laws. Maybe they wrote them at women's behest, and we can argue that as well. But if you're telling me that guys are complicit in a rape culture against women, right? A rape culture that women are subject to in a way that is uniquely worse than anything men face. But you're also going to tell me that men are responsible for the rape laws that outlaw raping women, and that don't necessarily treat raping men as the same level of crime or the same degree of violation when a woman does it, or when it's done the way a woman would do it. Then you're contradicting yourself, right?
Yeah.
And they can't quite. If you put those two things together, you get blocked instantly, right? You get blocked. You can't tell them that if men are responsible for the rape laws, they can't also be responsible for rape culture, considering the rape laws outlaw exactly what feminists want outlawed.
Yeah, and they don't. The rape laws really favor men in any way whatsoever, right?
Right.
They don't. Like they don't. It's like it. This is one of the things that it's so hard to get through to feminists, right? Like, I was just on a video today where this feminist woman was on a 2-year-old video, but it was a fairly recent, and she was saying, well, we still have a long way to go. It was on that one about the woman saying that they should rebrand feminism as equalism, right? And this woman says, well, we should still call it feminism. Feminism is still necessary. We still have so far to go. Only 1/4 of Congress is women, for instance. And I'm just like, okay, how do you propose to fix that, right? Okay. And why does it even need to be fixed, right? And you ask them a simple question, right? Assuming that they're a feminist. What 3-person panel would you want to be adjudicating the issue of abortion once and for all? Once and for all, an ironclad law, an amendment to the Constitution that guarantees the right to abortion. Okay? Something that's unassailable or virtually unassailable, right? Guarantee women's right to abortion. Which 3-person panel would you prefer? Would you prefer Barack Obama, Chuck Schumer, and say Cory Booker, right? Or would you prefer Sarah Palin, Ann Coulter, and Michelle Bachmann? And would you really hold to the idea that men can represent the, quote, interests of women, right? And only women can represent the, quote, interests of women? If you had to choose between those 2 panels of people discussing the issue of abortion and putting it to rest for all time, really? You'd really pick the women there. You'd really pick the women there because men aren't allowed to have abortion, last I checked.
Exactly.
Right?
And then
you need to have women making the decisions, otherwise women aren't represented.
Right. And then when women make the decision in the way that feminists don't want them to, what is going to be their fucking answer then?
Yeah,
internalized
they don't.
misogynies. The other side of that though is you have this it's more of a phenomenon than anything, but it's a mentality in society. Women are wonderful, girls are wonderful, they're perfect, they can do no wrong, don't criticize them, right? Until until you look at, Sarah Palin and those guys. But girls raised with the idea that they can do no wrong. That everything they do is as good as it needs to be. How are they ever going to reach the level of excellence it takes to become a CEO? How are they ever going to learn the ropes of politics sufficiently to actually run for office and win? How are they ever going to display the level of accountability, personal accountability, academic accountability, work ethic, all of that? How are they ever going to be able to demonstrate those qualities to the public sufficiently to become a congresswoman? How are they ever going to get enough people in their district to accept this is the best person for the job? When she says XYZ, she really means it. Well, they have to run in a district like AOC, where only 4% of the population votes, and we're not sure that 3% of that isn't voter fraud, right? That is how you get that kind of woman in Congress. So you see this going on with kids growing up. This is one that I remember from when I was a kid. I was on a little girl softball team, right? And I sucked. I was horrible. I was a good hitter, but that was it. I could hit the ball and I could get it, far enough out into the outfield that my little crappy running, because I was not a good runner. I could still get to first base, sometimes even second base if somebody dropped the ball, right? But I was never going to hit a home run. And I was never going to catch somebody out, because if it was coming down at me from the sky, I could see the ball, but I couldn't tell how far away from me it was. And that's me not having good depth perception, really. And so I was on a team with girls who went on as high school players on our school's team to go to state. Like, these were state championship softball players. And I was not. I was never going to be. But I had people telling me, you know, don't feel bad. You're a great softball player. You're on a championship team, you know, and our team always won. And I always was just a kind of along for the ride, doing my best to keep up. And it was, my dad was the only person who was on solid ground with where I was on that team. And he helped me practice to get better. And he helped me recognize that one of the great things being on that team was getting to be friends with the girls on that team, who were just a bunch of great girls too. They were, they were great players because they were accountable and they had skill, and they were all nice to everybody. You know, they were good winners, good losers, good everything. I really lucked out and had a bunch of girls on my team that were great to associate with. My dad made sure I knew that, you know, and he made sure that I knew that I didn't have to be the best player on the team to be a valuable part of the team. And I didn't have to need people to coddle my sensibilities regarding how good or bad I was on the team in order to enjoy being a part of that team. And it took, you know, him talking to me about it and everything for me to keep my feet on the ground and not act like I was something I wasn't, and not resent when somebody did better than me, and not get frustrated because I wasn't doing better than me. And I think society does that to girls all the time. You know, I didn't have to be prettier than the girl across the alley. The girl across the alley was prettier than Gwyneth Paltrow. She got into high school, she was literally, in my book, she was prettier than Gwyneth Paltrow. And I knew that I was not prettier than her, and I was never bothered by it, because why would you be bothered by not being prettier than somebody who's prettier than one of the biggest stars? You know, at the time it was more like Brooke Shields. She was prettier than Brooke Shields. I think that would have been one of the bigger models at the time. You know, she was prettier than Nicole Kidman. But in any case, like, having that ability to not get butthurt over having somebody do better at something than you. The thing I was better at was photography. And I won prizes at the state level in 4-H every year that I was in 4-H, except for the year that I got sick and couldn't go. And every kid couldn't do that, right? So, you know, you learn a lot of lessons as a kid growing up to enjoy being around the people who are good at things that you're not, and to enjoy being good at things that other kids are not. To be able to make money with stuff that other kids aren't making money with. And I think a lot of gals don't get those lessons because all of society is busy telling them you're perfect the way you are. You don't have to do better. And so they don't. And then they don't become CEOs, and they don't become congressmen, and then feminists want tokenism to replace it.
Right. Or we're just too protective of girls. Like, for instance, my mother, when I was in elementary school, I was in gymnastics and I loved it. I did very well. You know, there were certain things that I couldn't do. Like, I could not do a head spring, right? I can't do it. There's something about me going backwards and upside down, you know, psychologically, I couldn't do it, but I excelled at the trampoline and the mini horse. Well, one day during practice, I'm, you know, going over the mini horse, doing the routine, and, you know, it's got the, you know, the elastic part in the middle, which is held to the frame by the tightly coiled springs. Well, I jumped onto the trampoline and my foot got caught. One of my toes got caught in the spring, but the rest of my body, but the rest of my body was still going over.
Oh no.
Yeah. So,
oh no.
Yeah. So
Ow.
I sprained my toe, but, you know, as soon as that happened, like, that was it. I was not allowed to go back to gymnastics. My mother wouldn't allow it. You know, it's like, as soon as I get hurt, you stop me from my progress, you know, and I think a lot of parents do that.
Oh, you know what happened with my daughter, right? Because my daughter, we were living in Port McNeil, right? Which is a town that rains like 300 days a year. You might get snow sticking to the ground maybe for a week every winter, right? And so the kids all, like when there was snow, the kids would all bring their crazy carpets and their sleds and everything to the school. And there was the school was built on an uneven patch of ground, and they'd leveled out the ground. They'd terraced the ground. So there was a playground close to the playground close to the school that was perfectly level, or not perfectly level, perfectly flat, slightly pointing away from the school, graded away from the school. But and then there was a retaining wall. Right, it was about 8, maybe 10 feet high, and then they put their soccer fields up on the upper terrace of the school grounds up there, right? And so you had to be able to get the big ride-on mowers up to the soccer fields. So they had these 2 ramps, one on either side, right, where you could drive a vehicle up onto that upper level. Well, it was like a perfect place to sled, and one of them, and it was surrounded by trees, right? So you have this driveway, this ramp, surrounded by trees on either side, and the kids would all just at lunch hour and at recess they would sled, and they would only be allowed to sled if they had some kind of snow or rain pants on to keep their clothes dry. Fine, that's cool, totally agree with that. But so one day I get this call at during lunch hour. You're going to need to come pick up Rachel. I'm like, why? Well, because she's had an accident sledding, and I think she was in grade 3 or 4 at the time. And I'm like, oh, is it bad? And they're like, well, she's a little banged up, but we think she's going to be okay, right? So I get to the school, and I go to the office, and she's sitting there, and her face is all just barked up, and I was like, hey, Rachel, what does the other guy look like? And she says, like a tree. and I'm like, oh, okay. And so I make a point of telling the principal and the other the woman who does all of the other head office tasks. It was a very small school, only 95 students, K-5, right? And I made a point of telling them, like, you guys don't have to worry about me being upset about this, like, because they looked really worried. You don't have to worry about me being upset about this. Like, stuff happens, right? She's fine. Even if she wasn't, like, as fine as she is, like, she's not concussed or anything, doesn't look like anything serious. Even if it was something more serious, like she broke a bone, it would still be fine, right? Like, these kids playing, and stuff happens, right? So don't worry on my account, please, right? And the next day, I took her to school and my son, and they brought their sleds, and they were told there was no sledding. She got hurt.
Yep.
So nobody was allowed to sled.
That's kind of the way organizations have to react, because even if one parent is like, well, my kid should have known better, they should have been more careful, or this is not that bad of an injury, or whatever, you have...
Or it's just an accident.
It was just an accident. They still got to change something, because there's always, a dozen other parents that will be like, oh my God, a girl got hurt. And,
oh my God. Like, it was so frustrating. Right. And it's like, I'm just like looking at it like we literally had this. I mean, the sledding was such a treat for the kids in this town because the snow was so rare, right? That I'm looking out the window one day, it was like minus 15 Celsius with a wind chill of minus 20. It never gets that cold there. And the wind was gusting at almost hurricane force. And there's this kid across the street from my house with a crazy carpet. He wants to sled in this weather, right? In the churchyard, because the yard sloped down toward the church from the sidewalk. And he wants to sled there. And the wind rips this freaking crazy carpet out of his hand and it on a roof, like almost a block away, right? And he's just standing there going, oh, in the middle of the blizzard. It was like a horrific, like your skin freezes in less than a minute kind of blizzard. But he wanted to sled. And it's like, okay, so now nobody's allowed to sled. That's great. That's awesome. I tried not to mention that to Rachel, that, or indicate that it was,
no,
because
it's not her
accident.
fault. It's because of the
Not
way,
her fault.
right? No, it's because of the way things are, and you see that at schools everywhere.
Yeah.
My dad, when he was the head teacher at elementary school in my community when I was a little kid, actually before I was a little kid, he had to institute a rule at the school. When the kids were going to come in from recess, they would line up. He used pavement marking paint. He put numbers on the playground. You had a circle and your grade number in it. And, there were the younger kids on the first floor went out for first recess, and the older kids on the second floor went out for second recess. And that way, because it wasn't a very big playground. And that way the kids all had kids their age to play with, and all the playground equipment was available to everybody, and, and that kind of thing. And at the end of recess, the teacher would stand next to the number, or even on the number, for your grade. Your teacher came out and walked a line of students in, and they would be dismissed in order, and it would go back and forth. So, one time they would do first grade, next time they would do third grade first. Kindergarten had their own recess, and it was that way with fourth, fifth, and sixth. Fourth graders first one time, sixth graders first the next time. When you're in the middle grade, you never get to go first, because you're in the middle grade. But that every other year, sometimes you get to go, but you always get to go second when you're in the middle grade. And so the kids, didn't go running in and then trip over each other and fall and knock their teeth out. And at the same time, they learned that there are sometimes you have to do things in an orderly fashion in order to avoid injuries or accidents and stuff like that. But recess itself was free for all. We had monkey bars, we had slides, we had balls that you just play whatever game you want to play with it. We had a tether ball, which I would bet that there is not a playground, a school playground, at least not a public school playground in the United States today, that has a tetherball in it, because kids just about knock each other's heads off with those things.
Yeah, there's like not a school on the planet that hasn't had a kid get a broken nose from a tetherball at some point.
So yeah, we had stuff like, we had teeter-totters, we had jump ropes, we had everything, right? And the kids played together. And we didn't have, when that school closed and I went to the next elementary school I went to, there was a big field, just big empty open field that was part of the school property that was up against the playground. And the boys and a few of the girls would play tackle football, no pads, sandlot tackle football through recess. And nobody ever stopped them. They probably aren't allowed to do that anymore either. But there were things you did in an orderly fashion for a purpose, and then the kids were allowed to be kids. We don't have that today anymore.
Yeah.
But the conclusion that I want to sort of put on this is this kind of stuff that we've been talking about, the differences in allowing kids to experience like I said, the results of their choices, the results of their actions, the world around them and stuff like that, as much as possible, raises them up in the idea of personal accountability, raises them up in the idea of having control of their outcomes by adjusting their choices, right? We don't see that anymore, and we've seen it deteriorate rapidly with women and girls, partly as a result of feminism, partly as a result of just the evolution of society in a world where every generation is more protective than the last. And we've had that happen before with our society in terms of things like, you got to have a chaperone everywhere you go, and then all of a sudden you don't, and it goes back and forth between those levels of helicopter monitoring of the youth. And although I'm not entirely sure the youth aren't monitored a little bit too small amounts when it comes to dating, but that lack of ability to learn those things in girls, a lot of that comes from that women are wonderful message. And that is almost entirely a feminist thing. I mean, we have a social pedestal that women are on to begin with. But feminists have sort of turned it into, I don't know, almost the base
They've
of a
encoded it.
statue, right? They've
Yeah.
they've
Well,
made
no,
it. Yeah, they have
they've-
encoded it.
They've taken women are wonderful and they've entrenched it in.
And like, women are wonderful used to come with, women are expected to live up to women are wonderful. So you're expected to be a caring person. You're expected to have a higher degree of ethics when it comes to your sexual choices. You're expected to be, if you want your sensibilities coddled, you have to demonstrate that those really are your sensibilities by not engaging in the same behavior that you are going to condemn other people for engaging in. Now we have this situation where women are expected to be seen as if they are up on the pedestal at all times, even though most of the time they're barely touching it, right? They're just as crass, just as crude, just as rude and obnoxious as feminists say men are. They are just as irresponsible as feminists say men are, and they feel entitled to be that responsible or irresponsible because feminists say men are. And then they bitch about not getting the rewards out of life that feminists say men have. Because
Those men who get those rewards do it by being responsible for the most part. I mean, there's people who there's always people who know how to game the system, how to scam success out of thin air. That one woman who she had that medical company. She was going to make like a lab on a chip or something like that. What was her name? This blonde woman, right? And it turned out to be one of the biggest research and development frauds of all time. She essentially promised, I'm going to deliver this amazing technology, and then it was like the whole thing was just a scam, and she got rich, and all her investors lost their money, right? So you have people of both sexes who are going to cheat the system for sure. But when you're really looking at things, when men accomplish things, I'm just to give an anecdotal example from my guy just took a position with it's a contract position with a big corporation, right? And it's an energy company. It handles a significant percentage of the world's the globe's energy assets, right? And he came on. He was there to just do, updating of the computer systems, the control systems, and stuff like that. Just regular run-of-the-mill updates that you have to do, and all of that, right? And he was supposed to be trained for I guess the headhunter had told him they usually give you about 5 to 6 months of training before they, really put you into the role. So he's like, okay, they're willing to invest in me. So, that's cool. Even though I'm a contract employee, if they're going to invest 5 to 6 months of training into me, that's great. So then he has this person who's supposed to be training him. And she's a woman, and she's diligent, and she operates within the parameters that have been set for her and does the tasks that are put in front of her in the way that she's been told to do them. So she's competent in that way. And she spends about 2 weeks training him, and then she's like, I have nothing more to teach you. And then he starts saying, you can actually script this task. This task that's stressing you out, you can actually script that, right? And then some higher ups start looking at him and going, okay, let's give him some admin. Let's give him access to the API framework for like this, that, and the other, right? Let's see what he can do, because he's taking an initiative, right? So this woman who'd been there for 1.5 years, it had never even occurred to her that some of her tasks, her mundane, regular tasks that she has to do once a month that stress her out because a lot of typing and it's a lot of memorization, that she could write a script and have that task be done by the script. Never occurred to her, right? But my guy, because of, and he's a lateral thinker, sort of a bit of a, he's not very detail oriented. He's very systems oriented, and he's got a very bad memory. So in order to be able to be competent, he has to have a rock solid understanding of the underlying concepts, that because he doesn't ever know when he's going to forget what equation to use under this particular circumstance. So he has to understand the underlying concept so that he can think his way into writing the equation from scratch, not from memory, because he doesn't remember it, right? So because his brain works that way, he's probably going to go higher and higher up in that company. And his coworker is not, because she doesn't take any initiative, and she does not have, I guess, the talent or the wherewithal to think of quicker, faster, more accurate ways of doing the work that's been assigned to her. She's just doing it. She's doing the work that's put in front of her in the way that she was told it should be done, by the step-by-step processes she was taught. So
and girls thinking that way are coddled in school. It used to be you had more, not so much a micromanaged structured environment. Like, you still had a structured environment in the classroom, but if boys did things their way and girls did things their way, and they arrived at the same ending point of understanding the material, that was all good. And then the teachers usually would encourage people to try things differently than their normal way of doing them. So you had girls, discovering that it's actually kind of fun to analyze and evaluate and figure out easier ways to do things, or mess with materials and see what you can create out of them other than what the instructions say you should create, and things like that, instead of following the instructions to the letter. And that's sort of, now, if you don't follow the instructions on everything to the letter, you don't succeed in school. It's almost an exercise in learning to be a computer. Insert, input data, receive student performance, and that's really, it's really a shame for both sexes, because boys get shoved into the girl category as defective girls, and girls never get pulled towards thinking outside the box.
We're taught not to step out of our comfort zone.
Yeah, and you should step out of your comfort zone as much as possible. Yeah. But I'm gonna move us into the super chats, and I guess the upshot of this for me is, because people short circuit and they get stuck in that loop between having to view things through the female victim narrative, the female victim perspective, having to hide from female accountability, and not wanting to view themselves as prejudiced against men. We're going to have to start talking, I think, more of us publicly about the fact that there is an accountability gap. You hear wage gap, you counter with accountability gap. You hear reproductive rights, you counter with accountability gap. You hear domestic violence, you counter with accountability gap. Don't hit first. That's accountability. And even if it's wrong for a guy to hit back, that doesn't make it not wrong for the woman to hit first. Accountability gap. So all of those things, sexual violence, accountability gap, every area of the men's rights movement, everything we address, everything we talk about, even suicide, is touched by the accountability gap. There are women who self-harm for attention. It is not questionable. It is offensive to feminists to discuss that, but it is the truth. It doesn't mean that every time a woman tries to commit suicide, she was just doing it for attention. But not acknowledging that it happens could be just as deadly, because sometimes gals that are self-harming for attention accidentally succeed in committing suicide anyway. And, that's... if you want to save lives on both sides of that, the other end of the accountability gap in the area of suicide is that there are men who commit suicide because they are denied the ability to maintain their relationships with their children, mentor their children, protect their children, love their children, and so what have they got left when the most important people in their lives, the people whose welfare that they have built their adulthood being invested in, are taken out of their lives? And then they do kill themselves. And that is an aspect of the female accountability gap as well. Nobody's allowed to blame the mother who alienated the children from the parents when a man is pushed to that degree of pain and suffering, and responds to it by killing himself. In fact,
on the other hand, we're supposed to feel for these women, the agony of being a 50-50 mom.
Yeah.
Remember that article?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Well, and then
the agony of having to share custody of your children, the agony that you go through by only having your kids half the time, and it's like, does it even compute in anybody's head that the alternative to that is that one of the parents doesn't have their kids at all?
Yeah. Well, and then the other thing is,
did either of you see that tweet about the guy at Planned Parenthood who was bawling outside?
Yes. Oh my God, that was so awful.
It broke my heart. It's the other side that we just don't look at, because when men are I hate using this word, when men are affected by these decisions, we don't care. We look the other way,
Yeah.
But there is a very real consequence that happens when you decide to end a life, because it's not, I'm sorry, feminists, I'm sorry, ladies, it's not just women that go through pregnancy and go through a loss when it happens.
The other thing I wanted to point out is feminists actually have the audacity when a man is pushed to that degree of pain and suffering and he kills himself, to presume that a last-ditch effort to abuse his ex-wife.
Yeah.
And they've actually
he
said that about specific men, right? Thomas Ball. Yeah. They basically, he did that to himself to abuse her. As if he wouldn't have found a more painless way than setting himself on fire, if that was the case. You generally don't punish yourself to punish somebody else. But in any case, so the thing I wanted to point out is we talk about, we aren't getting through to some people talking just about the issues themselves. And we aren't getting through to people who are willing to listen to what feminists say, necessarily. Talking about the human end of it, in terms of, this is the pain and suffering it causes, this is the damage it does to people, this is the inconvenience, this is the cost, and all that. And there are even people who are unwilling to listen when we talk about the cost to society, because they have the mentality that if society is losing out, then it's men's job to step up.
Yeah.
And that is where we need to bring up the accountability gap. Why? Why is it only men's job to step up? Why isn't it humanity's job to step up? Why are we not expecting, if women are equal to men, right? If we are demanding full-on equality for women, why isn't it women's responsibility to step up to the plate? Right? Is it women's responsibility to take a swing and hit the ball before they run to first base? Or are we going to actually call it equality when men have to step up and hit the ball if they're going to run to first base, but women are getting walked through their entire lives and told what a good job they're doing?
Yep.
So on to our super chats. We have...
I'm gonna step out.
Okay.
Sorry, ladies, I gotta go. I have a prior obligation, but
No worries.
great talk. I will see y'all next week.
All right.
All right.
See you next week.
I
Good
love
night,
you.
Lauren.
Night, Lauren.
Night.
First super chat is Rambam3000, who gave us £5 and said, "We live in more luxury than any medieval king. We have less gold coins in the basement." Or we just have less gold coins in the basement. Well, you never know. We could all be secretly rich. But yeah.
Here, fun fact. Apparently 10% of the gold is in the legal possession of housewives in India.
Oh, that's not surprising, considering, isn't that basically their insurance in case of a divorce? Yeah. So that makes sense. But and especially like if they don't want to have to work, or they're in a social God, I can't think of the term for their social degrees of importance.
Caste,
yeah, where they're expected to not work, to not be able to work.
Yeah,
then they have to do something like that. But no, that's not surprising at all. But yeah, I mean, you think about it, medieval kings still had to use a chamber pot and didn't have indoor plumbing. I don't even think that was invented yet. Medieval king didn't have antibiotics. If they got a bacterial infection, they got leeches, they got cuts, they got
hot mustard poultices,
amputations, whatever worked, or they died. So yeah, medieval kings. And of course, medieval kings, like, if the President of the United States actually were to declare war on another country, the soldiers would go, but the president wouldn't. A medieval king rode into war with the soldiers.
Sometimes he rode at the front, sometimes he rode at the rear.
But he still rode into war.
The ones who rode at the rear were not as well admired, but yeah.
Yeah. But they rode into war. They didn't sit in their castle and give directions. They went, and that's, like, I'm not saying that necessarily the leader should be going in to die, because then you don't have that leader anymore. But it's a luxury to not have to. And of course, women have always had that luxury. So then we have Sierra de Flora gave us $2. Said, quote, "I'll give you something to cry about," end quote. I don't think there's a Gen X child that hadn't heard that from anybody. I mouthed off to somebody once that said that to me, because it was another kid. I was in like first grade, and I was waiting outside the elementary school that I went to later to get on a bus to go to the elementary school I went to for the early part of my schooling. And somebody was mouthing back and forth, with another kid, and I heard, "I'll give you something to cry about," and I just looked at her, and I was like, oh yeah, what? And that was when I learned about Santa Claus. And I actually earned some respect by not crying. But
I told you Santa Claus wasn't real. My kid announced that.
Oh no, they weren't that nice. They told me Santa Claus was dead.
Oh yeah, no, my son did that. He died a long time ago. In his grade 1 kindergarten split class at lunchtime, and his friend is saying, I got $5 from the Tooth Fairy last night. And he says, "Oh, hey, the Tooth Fairy isn't real. It's just your mom and dad putting money under your pillow. Oh, and by the way, Santa Claus was a real guy, but he's been dead for a long time." Right?
Yeah.
And it's just like, and I'm like, just shut up. Right? And what are you doing? And because he was, I think he was in grade 1 at the time, and there was like, so there were a bunch of like 5, 6, and 7-year-old classroom, and they all just like went completely like white in the face, and they're just all sitting there like, and then this little girl, Riley was her name, she pipes up, "I think Santa is real as long as you believe in him."
Oh.
And then the universe was saved, right? And the other parents stopped giving me dirty looks, right? Because I mean, like, he knew the tooth fairy wasn't real because he only got a toonie, $2, right, for his teeth, and his friend got $5. And he knew that Santa wasn't real because the rich kids in his class got a trip to Disneyland for Christmas, and all he got was like new clothes.
How
right?
did Santa's
And
elves make a
video
trip
games.
to Disneyland?
And a couple of video games, and it's like, he's like, okay, if Santa was real, right? He'd give the poor kids the trip to Disneyland, right?
Well,
Wouldn't
maybe
he?
Santa's not
Doesn't
a
that make
socialist.
Doesn't that make sense? That, you know, he wouldn't give rich kids whose parents can afford a trip to Disneyland land on the house.
The best
Right?
part, though,
So-
the best part was I'm standing there, and you know, the bus shows up, and at the same time, you know, a teacher comes out for the kids that were waiting that were not supposed to be getting on that bus, and to take them in, and the girl that the other girl had said to, "I'll give you something to cry about," turns to the teacher and says, "Susie just told a little kid there is no Santa. She said Santa was
God.
dead." And the teacher just looked at her. The look she gave her was like, you know, I if she had unhinged her jaw and swallowed the other girl's head, I would have been not surprised at all. Like, if her
Oh my
eyes
God.
got any bigger, they would have popped out of her face. She was livid. And then
Oh
I
my
got
God,
on the
like-
bus, and I didn't have to deal with any more of it. And I went home and asked my parents questions and got answers and didn't have a moment of worry about it the entire time. Never bothered me. But that was, I'll give you something to cry about. Why aren't you
Yeah.
crying?
Yeah.
It doesn't
like,
work
you know-
as well when an elementary school girl says it.
I guess maybe it was like because my kids, they all, particularly Rachel, asked very early, you know,
Yeah.
or they didn't ask. They said, "Mom, I think real."
Yeah, my first
and-
question was, how does Santa get into the house if the fireplace is bricked up to keep the bats out?
Yeah, well,
Santa's bigger
it's
than
like
a
he
bat.
he sneaks in a window, or he has magic, whatever.
My dad's
But-
answer is, what difference does it make whether the presents come from a fat man in a red suit or your dad?
Well, my kids were always just like, okay, here's why I think Santa is real. Can you confirm or deny this? Right? And I always would just ask them, well, okay, when they'd say, I don't think Santa is real, or I'm wondering if Santa is real, I would say, what makes you think that? And if their reasoning was sound, then I would be like, you're right, Santa's not real. And then I would tell them the story of the, you know, dude in the Alps, right, who put toys in the kids' shoes in his village and all of that,
Yeah.
right? Which is why Sam announced to the entire class that Santa was a real guy, but he's been dead for a long time. Right? And it's like, and he just thought he was like
Sharing
disabusing these
information.
kids of this ridiculous myth that they've all bought into for no reason, for no good reason. He's helping them out, right? And I'm just like, oh my God, what are you doing, son?
Well, I did
Right,
the
but
same
they
thing
all-
to the other kids with their notions of Cabbage Patches, so I think the Santa Claus thing isn't so bad.
Yeah, well, they all like mine. Well, I was never told about the Cabbage Patch.
Oh God,
right?
there were kids
never
in my
told-
neighborhood that until they were in like the 4th grade, they thought babies came from Cabbage Patches.
What?
I kid you not. They got
You know-
that old, and then the Cabbage Patch dolls came out when I was in the 4th grade, and they were the creepiest looking fucking little pieces of shit. I hate those dolls. I love Garbage Pail Kids because they look the way Cabbage Patch dolls make me feel. But in any case, yeah, no, that like disabusing the kids of notions that fake notions and everything. That's not really what the super chat was about, but it was kind of an interesting little tangent from it. And
There you go.
in terms of Santa, the thing I like the best is if you go find the chapter of one of the Little House on the Prairie books called The Christmas Horses. The discovery that Santa is not real. Laura Ingalls' mother made it a life lesson in values And what do you value in your life the most? Well, you value your family. You value your family's welfare. You love your father. You want your father to be able to do his field work without killing himself. Let's ask Santa for horses for Christmas, because then your father will go buy horses, and then he'll have more time to spend with you guys, and he'll have an easier time in the field. And they did. It was actually a great story. This was a moment of growing up.
There you go.
Yeah. But
well, when my youngest when he had his suspicions by me, he decided that he was going to help wrap the presents, and he was going to help stuff the stockings, and that was, he really wanted to be involved in, because just because there's no Santa doesn't mean that there's not surprises for people. And if he could help stuff everybody else's stocking and wrap everybody else's presents, then he would be helping surprise them with stuff, and then it would be taking the burden off of me. So he was very enthusiastic about that for several years.
Oh yeah,
so,
and that was the other end of that. The Christmas horses story was Mrs. Ingalls basically pointed out to the girls, anytime that you have the impulse to be generous to people out of your own love and compassion, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, but basically that human interest in showing your love and compassion and investment in other people's welfare by doing things to make them happy. That's Santa Claus, and that's basically the way that she described it, and it fixed things for the girls in the story. And I thought that was a pretty neat description. Basically, she described generosity as being the Santa Claus within everybody. But and now we've had our Christmas in June. Christo Fearson gave us $10 and said, "My mother was always protective when I was a kid, yet my father always wanted me to explore more and do my own thing. Gotta wonder if that's common for kids. Also, love you, Karen."
Oh, thank you. And it is common for kids to have a protective or a more protective mother and a father who's. It's typical. It's typical at the playground, right, when both parents are there and a kid's and the dad's yelling, "You can go higher, you can do it," and the mom is yelling, "Don't go too high. You can come down anytime you're scared."
Yeah.
Right. So there you go.
Oh yeah. Or it's okay. It's okay with the mother if you give up, and the dad's like, "No, you got to try that again. You can do it." Yeah. That's pretty typical. Mm-hmm. So, but in any case, I think we are gonna go ahead and conclude the show at this point, because I think we've talked the subject pretty much to death, and some tangents.
Tangential subjects
yes.
as well. I think honestly that it really is, like you said, that every single men's rights issue, at least when it comes to any kind of discrimination that they suffer when they're in a kind of a conflict, or they come into a conflict of interest with women, right? It really is an accountability issue, like a reluctance to place accountability on women.
Yeah.
For their decisions.
And even when lack of female accountability or reduced female accountability isn't the cause behind the entire issue itself, like it does, there are aspects that it does touch on it, like with male suicide. Men commit suicide for a variety of different reasons, but among those reasons, there are some that are very difficult to address and very difficult to figure out a solution to, because we can't hold women accountable when they do bad things to men.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
With that, I want to move into a shill. I want to remind everybody that the International Conference on Men's Issues is still coming up, and there are still tickets available. So if you are interested, we have some great presenters at the conference. We've got
probably like half of your favorite cast Pill movie.
Yep.
Half of the favorites there are in that movie are going to be, so not the feminists, not Michael Kimmel or Catherine Spiller of the Feminist Majority Foundation, but Paul Elam and Mark Angelucci and Tom Golden and Tim Goldich and Steven Svoboda and a whole bunch. Fred Hayward. Fred Hayward is the father of who told the story of fighting for custody of his boy. That probably made, if nothing else in the movie made people cry in the audience, it was that story where he essentially talked about how the fight for just maintaining 50-50 freaking out 50-50 custody of his son was destroying his health. It was such an uphill battle just to maintain 50% custody of his son that his health suffered and he ended up giving up. And one of the most wonderful things about the release of that movie was that after the movie came out, his son watched it and saw his father in it, and they have come back together. His son is, in his teens now, and his son is sort of starting to understand what his dad went through and doesn't feel abandoned, and they've sort of been reunited. So lots and lots of people.
Yeah, I've mentioned Tom Golden numerous times on the show because of his unusual approach in terms of the way most of the field of psychology looks at men. And like he and Paul and Dr. Tara Palmatier, they're all more centered on solving problems the way men would solve problems, looking at helping men solve their own problems and things like that, rather than trying to make men's problems fit into feminine ways of handling problems. And so he's going to be there. He'll be doing a talk as well. There's also, I think we've seen Tommy Sotomayor mentioned quite a bit. He's going to be there. He'll be giving a talk.
And his by the way, his movie Fatherless has been like a few years in the making.
Yeah.
Right. It released just 4 days ago. So you can go to the IMDb page Fatherless America or to the website fatherlessamerica.com, I believe, and download the movie, watch it, and you can watch it on Vimeo. I think you can rent it or buy it on through Vimeo. So, but that's been sort of a labor of love. He has a reputation of being, kind of a little bit Paul Elamish in some of his broadcasts, using harsh language and sometimes derogatory language and all of that when describing the situations that he's seeing around himself. But I would suggest that anybody who has any doubt about whether he's suited to the task of being a keynote on men's issues at this conference should go watch his interview with Dave Rubin, which is available on YouTube, where he is just absolutely the relaxed, circumspect, thoughtful person that you can see glimpses of in between the rhetoric in his radio show. So,
yep,
yeah.
And all the rest of the information, there's quite a bit more information. We're not going to be able to go over it all on the show. But if you go to icmi.info, you will be able to see it. The link is in the low bar of this video. So definitely go take a look. Go check it out. And see if you can, or if you want to register to attend ICMI. And hopefully we'll see you there. But with that, thanks everybody for listening, and even though Lauren's not still here, thanks to my two co-hosts. The sausage was not quite so long this time, but it was still not short. And thanks to everybody who stuck it out listening to the show. Thanks to everybody in the background who makes HBR Talk happen. And good night, all.